This is Trial Transcripts Exposed by Crime in Court with Heather. Raw courtroom reads with my commentary. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Crime in Court with Heather. This is Trial Transcripts Exposed, and we are continuing on with the Menendez brothers' defense of their case. This is the 1996 retrial. Dog wants to go under the blanket. As you can see, she likes her blanket. But she wanted to be on camera, I guess, first. So, anyways, we are continuing on with the testimony of Dr. John Wilson, who is a trauma expert, and especially with child abuse. So, we're going to continue with him. This is his cross examination by the state. And let's get started. So this is Wednesday, January 24th, 1996, and we already completed the first part of the day. So this is the afternoon after lunch. And just a little FYI, I have been recovering from a pretty bad POTS flare up this weekend. The heat just and the air quality stuff was like not doing good for me. So, this particular episode, I should have recorded it and it should have aired by now. So whatever. Basically you missed a day, or I missed a day of our regularly scheduled programming because I just wasn't feeling well. So this is actually you missed last Thursday, so this is your Sunday episode. Sorry for that, but unfortunately, just wasn't feeling good. It was hard to even like talk and not get winded. That's how bad I was feeling over the weekend. But I'm feeling better today, so let's get started. The court says, are we set to go? Mr. Conn says yes. So the court says, okay, the jury is back. You may continue your cross-examination. Mr. Conn says yes. Dr. Wilson, this morning you were talking about the defendant making a report of sexual molestation to his cousin, Andy Cano. Is that correct? Yes. Now, did you also question the defendant regarding his relationship with Andy Cano? I'm not sure what you're asking. I just realized you guys can't see the script. Sorry about that. Just seeing my face as I read it. That's probably not very fun. So he says, now, the next question from Mr. Conn was, did you also question the defendant regarding his relationship with Andy Cano? He says, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Well, when you interviewed the defendant in county jail, did you have a conversation with him concerning his relationship with Andy Cano? In general, yes, says the witness. Okay, I would like to show you tablet 1. Do you have your copy there? Yes, I do. What are you referring to? Tablet 1, page 4. Ms. Abramson says, may I have a moment, Your Honor? Your Honor, I'd like to approach. I object to what counsel is going to try to do here. The court says you have an objection to the proposed question. Yes, Your Honor, the whole topic. The court says, okay, since I don't know what you're talking about, we'll have a little hearing at a sidebar. So we're going to go very quickly to sidebar. The court says, yes. Ms. Abramson says, let me show you what's page 4. This has to do with Andy and Erik having sexual play with their cousin Anna Maria, which I think is irrelevant, embarrassing to the family, and no reason whatsoever to get into this, no possible reason. The court says, without reading it, what is it that you want to get into? Mr. Conn says, actually, I wasn't even going to get into the Anna Maria part, just the first part, to clarify what he's saying about at ages 6 or 7, we used to play with each other sexually also with Andy. Ms. Abramson says, Andy with Anna Maria. That's what he's talking about. Since he doesn't know the answer, I think this is an area that's unduly prejudicial and confusing. The court says, what doesn't, or who doesn't know the answer? Ms. Abramson says, Mr. Conn. Does the witness? Asks the court. Ms. Abramson says, I don't know. I haven't asked the witness what all was meant here since it didn't seem relevant. If we're going into this, we should do it out of the presence of the jury. I think I know what it means based on my own knowledge that Andy and Erik used to play sexually with Anna Maria, which I think is totally irrelevant to get into. The court says, what do you want to find out about? Mr. Conn says, he's already been talking about the relationship between Erik Menendez and Andy Cano and conclusions that he drew concerning that relationship. I want to explore that relationship a little bit further to find out exactly what it is that Erik Menendez told him about this. Or yeah, what he told him about this. Here we have words from Erik Menendez about what appears to be having a sexual relationship with Andy, and that's the way I read this. I want to find out if that's what he wrote down, if that's what Erik Menendez said. Miss Abramson says, first of all, he hasn't talked about the relationship with Erik and Andy. He talked about a report that Erik made to Andy and nothing more. Counsel wants to mischaracterize it in order to get in this kind of material, which is irrelevant. And counsel says, I don't know what the witness knows. I'll permit inquiry outside the presence of the jury of this witness. But if there's something else you can go on to before we get to this, so we don't have to break right this minute because it just started, it would be a help. Mr. Conn says, all right. The court says, all right. Mr. Conn, uh, Mr. Conn says, now, Dr. Wilson, was it your testimony that the defendant didn't relate to you any fantasies about killing anyone? Objection, Your Honor, misstates the testimony. The court says overruled. The witness says, did he relate to me that he didn't have any fantasies about killing anyone? Yeah. Any thoughts about killing anyone? The witness says, yes, in the sense of homicidal thoughts. Okay, says Mr. Conn. The defendant didn't tell you that he had fantasies of killing his father with a tennis racket? He may have told me that. I'm not sure. Directing your attention to tablet 1, page 14. Okay. You see that last paragraph? Yes. Did the defendant Erik Menendez tell you that he had fantasies of killing his father with a tennis racket? Yes. He wanted to smash his head? Yes. You testified the other day that the defendant indicated to you that he did not have any thoughts about killing anyone. Is that correct? That was in terms of homicidality, however you say that. Yes. Well, here, aren't we talking about killing his father with a tennis racket? Fantasy of killing his father with a tennis racket is what he reported. Wouldn't that go towards homicidality? Not as I understand it, it wouldn't. Why wouldn't this qualify for homicidality? This is his report of a fantasy. He had at some time. You're not following along, they just interrupt each other. The homicidality question that was asks Mr. Conn on the exam was, have there been times when you felt like seriously harming or even killing someone? Is that correct? Yes, that's correct, says the witness. So are you saying that if I fantasize all the time about killing my boss, that I should rate myself 0 on that question because I do not feel like seriously harming him or killing him? No, says the witness. Well, then why wouldn't it qualify for homicidality? It could qualify. What do you mean it could? Either it does or it doesn't. Objection, argumentative. The court says, rephrase the question. The question is, if someone says, I have had fantasies about killing my boss, okay, does that qualify for homicidality? Yes. Can you tell us then why you decided to allow the defendant to give himself a never rating in spite of the fact that he had told you that he had fantasies of killing his father? Because that's what he said when he took the test. Well, you interviewed, these notes that you took from him were in September of 95, is that correct? Correct. And then when did you give him that test? On 12/17/95. So you gave him the test 3 months later, is that correct? Correct. And so you knew at the time you were giving him the test that he had previously told you that he had fantasies about killing his father, is that correct? That's in the notes, correct. Okay. And so when he told you, I've never had any thoughts about killing anyone, you just took that on face value and allowed him to give himself a never rating? Correct. Didn't you say that you asked probing questions to find or to kind of look for truthfulness in the assertions given to you by someone? Yes. Okay, so did you probe him a little bit and say to him, "Oh, wait a minute, Mr. Menendez. Now, I know I caught you in a lie because you told me 3 months ago that you had fantasies about killing your father." Yes, as you recall yesterday, I did testify that I did ask a probing question then, and that his answer was, I'm not a violent person. I've never been a violent person. I've been a passive person. I've never had thoughts about wanting to kill anybody. That's not who I am." That's what he said to my probe when I asked about that question. Do you understand the question I just asked? Yes. Which is, if you knew that 3 months earlier he had admitted to you that he had had fantasies about killing his father, why didn't you probe him in that area? I think because at the time I was administering the question, I didn't have this particular thing in mind. So you forgot about it? Uh huh, yeah. So this rating is an inaccurate rating. No, it's not. Can you tell me why? Because that particular associated feature of post-traumatic stress is looking at what's referred to as fantasies or rages at the source, at one perceived trauma, or one at one's perceived trauma. So if you have a person that's abusing you, you have fantasies or rages at that source at times. It usually talks about having explicit fantasies to each of the scores, a plan to get back at the person who in some way harmed you or was responsible for your injury. That's what this cluster is attempting to look at. As I interviewed Mr. Menendez and administered the caps on that day and also probed it didn't seem to fit. Now you're saying that the only homicidal feelings that qualify are homicidal feelings that involve a plan? No, I'm not saying that. I'm giving you the associated feature of post traumatic stress and what that's intended to measure in terms of the CAPS. So, what he's basically saying is that this is a common thing that can happen in people who have been traumatized, people who have been in a traumatic experience, usually by someone else. Like if someone else is abusing you, you may have violent thoughts against that person. Doesn't mean you're going to act on them. It doesn't mean you're actually going to do it. It just means that that's how your brain is processing your feelings for that person. You know what I'm saying? When you have an emotion, emotions basically alert you to how you're feeling about a situation. So when you have an emotion, emotions aren't good or bad. They just are what they are. So when you're having an emotion, but you might perceive it as like a negative emotion, like anger, you might perceive it that way. But really, that anger is trying to alert you to something's not right in this relationship, and there something needs to be corrected there. So a lot of times when you have a strong emotion about something, it is basically to alert you how you feel about the situation, because 9 times out of 10 you're probably putting it out of your mind, minimizing it, making it seem less than what it is. So your emotions are trying to help you remember you're feeling a certain way. So that is my little tip on feelings for the day. So basically he's associating with the those feelings of rage against Jose. He's associating that with, it's a common symptom of post traumatic stress disorder. It's a common symptom of trauma. It doesn't necessarily mean he's going to act on it. It's not a real fantasy, if that makes sense. It's not a real plan to act on. It's just something that your mind does to compensate for the abuse that you're getting. So Mr. Khan's next question is, I'm not asking you about the associated feature in post traumatic stress disorder. I'm asking about a question that you gave and why you allowed the defendant to give what appears to be the wrong answer. That is, he said he never had thoughts of harming or killing someone, and you knew that to be false, didn't you? Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, I'm going to object to that. It's argumentative and compound. Sustained as to the form of the question. Mr. Conn says, well, you agree today that the never answer was incorrect. Is that correct? It's not incorrect in the sense that that's how Erik Menendez responded to it at the time. Right, but it is incorrect, inconsistent with information that he previously gave you. Is that correct? This all was never in the first trial, FYI, because this conversation happened in 96. So the state has this ammo now to go after the defense because he's had all these different uh, interviews with psychologists and other mental health professionals and attorneys and all sorts of people along the way. Same with Lyle, and he's gotten himself into trouble doing that because he got, he was asking for people to lie for him. So he then eventually couldn't testify in this trial because of his actions and the people he was reaching out to and talking to and how he was talking to them. But it's just interesting because the state definitely continued to investigate well after they were in prison, well after the mistrial, continued to follow up on like what was going on in their prison calls and things and letters and stuff because they were intercepting them and finding, things that the brothers shouldn't have been talking about or doing or whatever. And not necessarily that they shouldn't be talking about it, but the state can use it and twist it in trial like they're doing here. You can just pick certain little things apart because you have all this info now, and any little inconsistency you see, it's like the state is jumping on that because they don't have a whole lot to basically counter that the parents were assholes. Sorry, pardon my French. The next question from Mr. Conn, but it is incorrect, inconsistent with information he previously gave you. Is that correct? It's in that regard, it is, yes. So if a person tells you on day one, I thought about killing someone, and on day two, when he takes the exam, he says, I never thought about killing someone, do you just go with his latest answer and forget what he told you on the first day? I think I've already answered that I didn't have a follow-up probe. Well, the follow-up probe didn't go to the information he gave or had given you within those 3 months earlier, did it? I think we already established that, says the witness. He's like, yeah, you got me here. Like, what else do you want? Like, do we need to keep harping on this? Mr. Conn says, I would ask the witness to answer the question, Your Honor. Yes. Mr. Conn says, well, doctor, let's turn to the final cluster under post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the cluster relating to the hyperarousal. Are there hyperarousal symptoms in the final cluster? Persistent symptoms of increased arousal and then, in parentheses, not present before the trial. Well, I have a chart here which lists, Ms. Abramson says, I'm going to object, Your Honor. Asked to be heard before the chart is shown. Court says, okay. Ms. Abramson says, I told counsel I was going to object. The court says, let's not talk about this now. Have you seen it? Ms. Abramson says, I saw it, and I told him I was going to object. The court says, all right, the lawyers have a couple of other things that they want to talk about. So unfortunately, we'll take time right now to talk about it and ask you to go to the jury room. And as soon as we're finished talking, we'll have you come out. The jury leaves the courtroom. They go into their jury room. The court says, okay. Mr. Conn says, yes. Before we even get into the objection that counsel says that she has, there's something else I want to put on the record. Court says, yes. Mr. Conn says, that is, once again, the comments of counsel. Now, counsel just indicated in front of the jury, I told the prosecutor that I had an objection. She did not tell me she had an objection. Ms. Emerson says, for heaven's sakes, you're being totally dishonest. The court says, what's happening right now? Ms. Emerson says, I'm sorry. Court says, what's happening right now? Not the merits of what you want to say. What is happening right now? What are you doing? Interrupting, Your Honor. The court says, let's stop interrupting. You have a chance to talk after he talks. Very simple. Simple rule. One person at a time, and then everyone will get a turn. Has he ever even once talked to the prosecutor like that? No, he has not. He always, anytime he gets a chance to like chastise Miss Abramson, he goes for it. Do you notice this? I really think he might have had some bias and some animus towards Miss Abramson. It shows, in my opinion. If I were someone objectively looking at it, which I am, that I started out looking at it pretty objectively. I always felt that the brothers, were abused. I always believed that the abuse was true and it really happened. But I came into this looking at it very objectively. And I see a judge that really doesn't like Miss Abramson. I don't know. It's pretty clear to me. Mr. Conn says, it's remarks like that, Your Honor, in front of this jury where she's going to make allegations. I told the prosecutor I was going to object. That just leads to the opposite side always wanting to make a comeback in front of this jury. No, you didn't tell me. I think that should be avoided. I don't want to engage in that behavior. That behavior is going to be provoked as long as counsel is permitted to make arguments like that in front of the jury. I'm going to ask counsel to be admonished not to argue an issue in front of the jury, to simply make the objection and allow the court to make a ruling. The court says, you're saying Ms. Abramson did not say she had an objection? Mr. Conn says, she absolutely did not. Ms. Abramson says, you are actually lying to this court. I am shocked. The court says, Ms. Abramson, you speak to the court, not to counsel. Ms. Abramson says, I don't know how to deal with a prosecutor who's so dishonest to this court. He showed me the chart. I said, I'm going to object to that. I don't know where it's coming from. We're going to have to be heard. I made it very clear. Oh, other counsel were here. So other attorneys were present at the time. I don't know what else to do besides that. And he tries to mark it and doesn't ask to see the court out of the presence. And he starts to mark it in front of the jury. I don't know how else I can say no. I'm going to object to that. He showed me and I said I'm going to object. And he says it in front of the jury. And I'm the bad guy. If he played by the rules, we wouldn't have said anything in front of the jury. The court says, now I'm faced with the issue of whether you did or did not tell Mr. Conn. You said there was somebody else who heard it. Who else heard it? Mr. Levin says, well, Your Honor, I heard a part of it. They were discussing whether or not Miss Abramson, I think, was discussing whether or not it was part of the DSM-3. Miss Abramson says, that's what Dr. Wilson said. Mr. Levin says, I did hear that portion of the conversation. I can tell this court, although I can't recall the specific contents, but Ms. Abramson was not happy with what was on the chart. I know that. Ms. Abramson says, Dr. Wilson was here. The court says, Mr. Conn, you're saying there was no discussion about this at all? No, Your Honor. Ms. Abramson says, you can ask the witness. The court says, you never showed this chart to anybody? Mr. Conn says, I showed it to Ms. Abramson this morning. I did hear her say to Dr. Wilson, what is that? And I heard him say something like, I don't know, maybe it's a DSM-3R, and that's all. Counsel did not specifically tell me she objects to this chart. The court says, okay, I'm not going to resolve this issue. I don't know what standard of proof to use, by the way, whatever the standard of proof. Ms. Amerson says, only one of us was under oath. That's the standard. The court says, it really doesn't matter, quite frankly. It's just a childish spat over nothing. It's just a childish spat. Even though the prosecutor may have lied to me, the court, it's nothing. It's just a childish spat. Just forget it. Don't you think you should know if your prosecutor is lying in this courtroom? Don't you think that would be something worth getting into? Worth looking at? I guess he doesn't. He goes on to say, seems to me that the prosecution was aware that the defense had some concerns about this. So this clearly, it could have been brought up without the jury being exposed to this in any fashion. So in the future, if you have such matters that are potentially in dispute, rather than bringing them up in front of the jury and causing delays such as this, do so before we have the jury in the box. That's the best I can say about it. That's how he admonishes the prosecutor. If you did do it, well, maybe you shouldn't. Miss Abramson, you're speaking out of turn and you need to shut up. Two very different approaches to the way he handles these people. Just pointing out there. As far as the specifics of this, what is the defense objection? Ms. Abramson says, I don't know what it is. I don't believe it's an accurate listing of the symptoms of increased arousal or of post-traumatic stress disorder that we have been discussing here, and therefore, I think it's a misleading exhibit. Court says, what is it that you propose to use this for, Mr. Conn? He says, these are the symptoms in the last cluster, the persistent symptoms of increased arousal in the DSM-4. Just one cluster of symptoms? Asked the court. Correct. Okay, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, let me have the witness look at it. The court says, let counsel look at it and Dr. Wilson look at it. The witness says, sure, I'll look at it. This title is not what corresponds to the DSM-4. So already, like the first thing on the page, the title doesn't correspond with the DSM-4. The court says, you don't have to talk to me about it, just look at it. The witness says, okay, all right, I looked at it. The court says, okay, and now you can offer with Ms. Abramson if she has some objection to it, and it's up to you to confer with her if you want to. Ms. Abramson and Dr. Wilson confer. Ms. Abramson says, however, the title should be persistent symptoms of increased arousal not present before the trauma. And this is symptoms of increased arousal in post-traumatic stress disorder. The court says the symptoms are identical. Okay, I see no problem with using it, so as long as it's clear that the title is incomplete. Let's take testimony from Dr. Wilson on this other subject, what we discussed outside the presence of the jury. Ms. Abramson says, I'd ask to close the courtroom to do that since it involves other parties who aren't on trial. It could be embarrassing. The court says, okay, we'll do that. Good. I'm glad we don't have to read that. Ms. Abramson says, thank you. So they sealed that part of the testimony. The court says, okay, the jury is back and will now resume. Mr. Conn says, Your Honor, I have an exhibit here that I'd like to mark as 404. The court says, Exhibit 404. Mr. Conn says, showing what has been marked as 404, did you have a chance to look at this exhibit during the break? Yes. And can you tell us what is reflected in this exhibit? Witness says, what's reflected in this exhibit are the 5 DSM-4 diagnostic symptoms for increased arousal following trauma. Mr. Conn says, and in order to find the cluster to be present, these symptoms have to be persistently experienced. Is that correct? Correct. Now, is there a difference between this cluster and the first 2 clusters that must be present in order for a finding of PTSD? Your question is there a difference in this cluster? Yes. Is there a different type of, well, let me rephrase that. The 3 cluster groups the various types of effects or symptoms of PTSD along some common ground. Is that correct? I don't know what you mean by common ground. Do the symptoms in cluster B have something in common? Yes. They're a form of reliving the trauma. That's correct. Do the symptoms in cluster C have something in common? Yes, there's symptoms of avoidance and numbing and detachment and changes following the trauma. Do the symptoms in cluster D have something in common? Yes, they're more biological or physiological based reactions as part of post-traumatic stress disorder. Are they also more behaviorally based? Yes. So this points more towards how PTSD affects a person's behavior. Is that correct? It shows how PTSD can be manifested in behavior as a change in this particular way. Okay, the first 2 clusters don't show the same type of manifestations in behavior as this cluster does. Is that correct? No. They can show up that way as well. No, sorry, that's the answer. No, they can show up that way as well. Uh-huh. And what way do the first 2 clusters reflect behavior? Well, for example, let's take 4 and 5. 4 and 5. Yeah, take 4 and 5. Intense psychological distress at exposure to internal and external clues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. This would be behavior. Indeed, if someone were to show increased stress, psychological distress, you could see they're distressed, they're more anxious, more upset, they may be more sad, they may cry. There's this increase in this kind of psychological distress. Likewise, with a B5 criteria, it says physiological reactivity or exposure to internal or external cues that stimulate or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. Again, this is a very very behavioral in the sense that you would have this be start over. Again, this is very behavioral in the sense that you would have this physiological reactivity that would be manifest, whether there's this exposure to some kind of a stimulus, a situation, a cue that would resemble or stimulate a traumatic event. This could include things like sweating, increased respiration. It could show the person being more agitated. It could show them becoming more tense. Show a change, for example, in the level of their speech patterns. It could show a change that would be behavioral. For example, in their face. If you look at whether or not they're flushed or whether they go pale or again other kinds of changes like that. So those are generally behavioral changes in the cluster B. Mr. Conn says aside from those two behavioral changes, all 5 on this chart are behavioral changes that are caused by PTSD. Is that correct? These are symptoms that can be associated with PTSD. Yes. Mr. Levin asks, Mr. Conn, there's a larger clip, or says, Mr. Conn, there's a larger clip on the corner. Ms. Abramson says, Mr. Conn, why don't you use the black clip on the inside, or on the side? Sorry. For some reason, the dogs think that my boyfriend's home and he is not. And they just messed up my mic, so give me 1 second here. Okay. Sorry about that. So Ms. Abramson says, why don't you use this clip? The witness says, clip it at the top. Mr. Levin says here, the witness says, I think this is a behavioral reaction of the symptom cluster to the chart. The court says, definitely persistent. The witness says, it is persistent and it is aroused, apparently the way it's moving around on the board. Mr. Conn says, now, one of the possible effects of symptoms of PTSD that is recognized by the American Psychiatric Association in the DSM is difficulty falling or staying asleep. Is that correct? Correct. And for this particular cluster, it is necessary to find 2 or more of those 5 in order to justify a diagnosis of PTSD. Is that correct? Yes. So you don't necessarily expect to find all 5 of these in every case of PTSD, do you? Correct. And none of these are necessarily required or recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as an essential feature of PTSD. Is that correct? No, that's incorrect. Well, why is that incorrect? Because to make the diagnosis, you have to have 2 of these 5. Just an FYI, I'm feeling lightheaded again talking, so I guess I'm not over this flare up. Just letting you know this might be a 2-parter that well, you'll get it in 1 part, but I might have to record it in 2 parts, so you may possibly see me in another outfit later because I might have to do this tomorrow. Just because it's hard to breathe, but we'll get through as much as we can. So right, says Mr. Conn. What I'm saying is there is no one in this group. I see what you're saying. That must be found, according to the American Psychiatric Association, to justify a finding of PTSD. Any 2, says the witness. In other words, there can be people who are not manifesting any symptoms whatsoever of hypervigilance and can still be properly diagnosed as suffering from PTSD, according to the American Psychiatric Association standards set forth in the DSM. Is that correct? That's correct. So, hypervigilance then is not a necessary feature of post traumatic stress disorder. In some people, that's correct. The difficulty in falling asleep uh, are these statistics as to in what percentages of cases you would find that particular symptom in post traumatic stress disorder? As I sit here, I'm not aware of any epidemi- ep- epidemiological, right? Is that how you say it? Data that would tell us for the population of people diagnosed with PTSD what the prevalence of that is. What do you mean by epidemiological? Epidemiological refers to studies where you would go to different sites or locations in the country and randomly sample or selectively sample a general population and using some kind of measure, whether it's biological or medical or a psychological measure, you look to see for those people that you've sampled out of the general population that you're interested in, what percentage of those people have a particular kind of condition or a particular symptom or a particular problem that you might want to know about so that you can make an extrapolation to the general population about the specific prevalence or the rate of that phenomenon. So, in other words, you're saying there's no statistics concerning how many people with post traumatic stress disorder suffer from that particular symptom. Is that correct? No, I'm sure there are statistics for different studies looking at this kind of measure. That is, reported rates of difficulty falling asleep. I'm saying something different, which is to say, do we know an estimate to the total population of people who have suffered post traumatic stress disorder? How many of them have specifically number one? Right. That's what I'm asking you. In other words, there are no statistics for the total number of people who suffer from post traumatic stress disorder. As to how many people suffer from symptom number one, well, as far as I know, that's correct. Okay, are there any statistics for symptom number two? What percentage of the total number of people who suffer from post traumatic stress disorder experience number two? Again, the answer would be the same for number two in terms of how I qualified it in terms of epidemiological assessment. For number two, in fact, says Mr. Conn, that was the one, that particular category, irritability or outbursts of anger, or was the one category that Erik Menendez, according to the way that he rated himself on your exam, rated himself as extremely low. Is that correct? That's correct. Now, the third one, difficulty in concentrating. Are there statistics concerning the population of people who suffer from post traumatic stress disorder as to what percentage of them suffer difficulty concentrating? As far as I know, there's same answer as I gave you before. Would the answer be the same for number 4? Yes. And would the answer be the same for number 5? Yes. All right, let's go through these then. I think the first three of them are pretty self explanatory. That is, they correspond to what the average person understands. Ms. Abramson says, I would object to that, Your Honor. The statement of counsel, they may or they may not. The court says he hasn't phrased it in the form of a question. If he does, maybe the witness would acknowledge it. The court says, okay, just let me focus, or what did I say? Mr. Conn says, okay, just let me focus on number one, difficulty falling or staying asleep. The question is, for someone suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, how much difficulty falling or staying asleep must a person experience in order for you to say this person qualifies for that particular symptom? The way we look at that, certainly in clinical terms, is by the person's self report or that of others. By the way, the person may be a spouse, someone who lives with them, someone who knows them quite well and is familiar with their daily habits, including their sleeping habits. So the issue here on number 1 really addresses 3 areas of the sleep cycle: the initial phase, the middle phase, and the terminal phase of the sleep cycle. So, as it pertains specifically to post traumatic stress disorder, we're looking at whether they have difficulty in going to sleep in the first place. That is, in the initial phase of the sleep cycle or staying asleep, meaning that they wake up in the middle of, or in the middle or terminal phases. Getting back to the question I was asking, says Mr. Conn, what type of sleep difficulty, how much sleep difficulty would qualify for finding that this particular symptom is present? Virtually any sleep difficulty. So if you couldn't go to sleep, for example, and you just couldn't fall asleep because you're too keyed up or aroused or having traumatic memories, that would qualify, or if you wake up. To finish answering your questions, let's say you wake up in the middle portion of your sleep cycle and you've had that sleep disrupted and you wake up. It may be as little as 5 or 10 minutes. You might be able to try to return to sleep, or it could be an hour. That varies a great deal from patient to patient who's having this particular problem. That sucks. I used to have sleep problems. Now I sleep through the night like nothing. And I think that all my medical issues contribute to that because I'm so exhausted. But um, with before I had everything that I have now, I couldn't sleep. I was like that, where I could lay in bed for hours, not falling asleep. Some nights I would fall asleep perfectly fine. Other nights, um, not so much, and I'd just be laying there for hours. Sometimes I would fall asleep fine, and then I'd wake up in the middle of the night and couldn't sleep for hours. So, I mean, I was going to work tired all the time, like in my 20s and early 30s, probably, I'll say. The next question from Mr. Khan is, okay, and this difficulty falling or staying asleep is simply one of the consequences of experiencing stress. Is that correct? Yes, it is. And it's something that many people, even if they don't suffer from post traumatic stress disorder, may experience that particular symptom as a result of stress. Is that correct? Absolutely. Mr. Khan says, now turning to number 2, irritability or outbursts of anger. Is there any particular degree of anger or irritability that must be demonstrated in order for a clinician to make a finding that this particular symptom is present? No, not really. Again, it's the same kind of answer for the first one. You're looking at a pattern of irritability, a pattern of outbursts of anger in the life course of the patient on a day to day basis. As it's noted in the manual, these are persistent symptoms. We're not looking for an isolated episode per se, but usually repetitive patterns with a sense of irritability or outbreak of anger. That's a consequence of stress. People who feel or experience stress sometimes become irritable. How about bursts of energy? Is that correct? Absolutely. Many people who do not suffer from post traumatic stress disorder can exhibit this symptom. Is that correct? Sure. Turning to number 3, difficulty. Difficulty concentrating. This too is a symptom, a common symptom of stress. Is that correct? It is. And many people who do not suffer from post traumatic stress disorder can have difficulty concentrating. Is that correct? Sure. I'd like to skip over number 4 for a moment and talk about number 5 first. Number 5, this is the fifth one that's listed in the DSM, which is one of the recognized symptoms of PTSD, exaggerated startle response. Is that correct? Yes. Can you tell us what an exaggerated startle response is? Sure. An exaggerated response is an exaggeration of the startle response. So, startle means when a person startles to some particular stimulus. It could be a sound, it could be a sight, it could be a smell, it could be something visual that causes a startle reaction. A startle reaction as an orienting towards a stimulus, orienting towards this thing that produces the startle. Now, an exaggerated startle response is an exaggeration of the startle response of a particular stimulus. In other words, it's a more pronounced behavioral response to that particular stimulus or situation. I believe I used an example the other day of the classic example of the war veteran who hits the dirt when he hears the backfire of a car because of an association with the noise similar to the firing of a gun or a weapon in a war zone and has this startle response and has an exaggerated startle response of diving on the ground. Mr. Khan says, and this is also a response to or a consequence of stress. Can be, sure. And hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is really just a fancy way of saying real alert. Is that correct? Objection argumentative, overruled. The witness says, would you say that again? Hypervigilance is just simply a fancy way of saying really alert. Yeah, it's a simple way to put it, really alert, super alert. Let me write that down. What do you mean by super alert? By super alert, I mean that the person is more than just vigilant. Now, vigilant means to scan and look out for things, to be, having normal perception, to be vigilant about what's going on around you, around oneself. When I talk about super alert or hypervigilance or hypervigilant alertness, we mean that the person has now this psychological disposition to be scanning the environment, to be keyed up, to be on edge, to be exceptionally vigilant to certain cues and situations and moves and stimulus that tend to be connected to the person with post-traumatic stress disorder, to the traumatic experience, so that they have this hyper tendency to be scanning the environment or to be looking out or to want to position themselves in a certain way that gives them more information about what is going on around them in a particular situation. Okay. How is hypervigilance detected? How is it detected? It can be detected in a number of ways. One way it can be detected is a self report. The person can describe to you their hypervigilant reactions. Number two, it could be detected by observation, that you can observe a person who appears to be manifesting hypervigilance. You can see it in their behavior, you can see it in the way that they're acting, in the way that they position themselves. The person of specific actions, or the kind of specific actions that they use. I used the example the other day of hotel survivors who are vigilant about where the exit signs are and count the number of steps from their particular hotel room to where their exit sign is in the hallway on the floor of their hotel, so that they know exactly what that distance is. That's a behaviorally observable thing. Most people tend not to do that when they go to a hotel. Someone who's been in a hotel fire may manifest that kind of a behavior. That's a behavior observation. There are other forms of behaviors that can tell you that a person is hypervigilant. For example, a common one, that is, where people can notice, is eye directionality. Often, people who are extremely hypervigilant have their eyes moving quickly in scanning the environment. Their eyes go back and forth. If you're the observer, you can look at that person and see their eyes are moving quickly back and forth. They seem to be checking out what's going on. That would be another measure of their hypervigilance. There are other ways as well. Another way would be, we talked about before, is the psychophysiological assessment, where you could look at speed of recognition or of cues in experimental paradigms to look to see if people are more hypervigilant, more for certain kinds of thresholds of recognition of stimuli or PTSD or things associated with their trauma than pictures or stimuli that are not associated with their trauma. That would be a behavioral measure of looking at the speed of recognition in terms of perceptual cues that would give you an indication of hypervigilance. Mr. Conn asks, now you told us that it is your conclusion that Erik Menendez is still suffering from post traumatic stress disorder. Is that correct? That's correct. And so Erik Menendez, right now, as he's sitting there today, is hypervigilant. Is that correct? Yes, it doesn't just magically go away, even if that person that you're afraid of dies. It doesn't just go away. This is something that is innate inside of your body. Like he said, it's physiological. Your body changes chemically in certain ways when you've experienced trauma. So you become hypervigilant, and it is not something you try to do. It's not something you consciously do. It's not something you can stop doing unless you make a conscious effort to stop it, you know? It's something that would really take a lot of time and effort and probably therapy and some kind of mental health practice to work it out. Mr. Khan asks, how could you tell by looking over at Erik Menendez right now? How could you tell that Erik is hyper alert? Well, I'm not looking at him right now, says the witness. Well, take a look at him and tell us what you see. What I see right now, okay, I see that he's intensely looking at me as you asked that question. And as you asked me to look at him, he quickly focused his gaze to me. He's focused on me because you asked the question about his hypervigilance. But how can you tell by looking at him that he's hypervigilant right now? I looked at it in terms of the speed at when you asked the question, and I looked at him upon your instructions. I looked at the speed at which he turned his head and looked directly at me. You can say based upon that you can tell that Erik is hypervigilant right now? Can I say that? I see that as an example. Is that evidence to you? Is that proof that Erik Menendez, proof that Erik is hypervigilant right now? In the context in which you asked me that question, which is to look at him to see if he's hypervigilant as you asked that question, and I turned and looked at Erik Menendez, he rapidly shifted his head position, lifted it up, and looked at me straight in the eye. That's a hypervigilant response. I mean, that's a pretty clear and cut answer. Now, during your interviews with Erik Menendez, did you see other evidence of hypervigilance? Sure did. Okay, tell us what it was. Yeah, there are a number of them that were really interesting to see. One was I have to describe the situation in which I interviewed him so I can give this situation. He was interviewed in a small room in the Los Angeles County Jail. The room is big enough to contain one desk, and in front of the desk there's an orange plastic chair, and on the other side of the desk is another plastic chair. And then to the left of that desk there's sort of another desk over in the corner, and then there's the door, which is, if you will, sort of in the center of the room. So when Erik Menendez was brought into the interview, he would be brought in chains and then unlocked and positioned in the plastic chair. And we'd have to move the desk so that I would have enough room behind it so that I wasn't scrunched up in my chair, and we had enough room not to be scrunched up in his chair. So we could do the interview across the desk. Typically, Mr. Menendez sat parallel to the desk. So if the desk goes directly in front of me, he's sitting parallel to the desk, meaning he's basically sort of looking towards this wall if that were the wall in the office. Okay, the on several so he's not facing the person who's interviewing him, apparently. He's facing a wall. Okay, on several occasions, and the door to the room was closed during the interview. On more than one occasion during the interview, there would be loud noises out in the hall. On one occasion, there was some screaming. There was a patient who was on the psych ward who's yelling quite loudly in a distressed state. On another occasion, there was a slamming of the door down the hallway, and on both of those occasions, just to take two examples, he flinched, and I'll illustrate this way. He was like this in the chair, and I'm interviewing him to my left, and then those events occurred right in the middle of the sentence of answering me. He went like, probably like jumped or something, and turned in an exaggerated way to this particular sound. So that was not only an example of startle response, but it was the vigilance. He quickly turned and scanned and looked up. Mr. Conn says, now, it's your opinion that not only was he hypervigilant at the time that you interviewed him and hypervigilant right there as he's sitting at counsel table, but he was also hypervigilant on August the 20th of 1989. Is that correct? Yes. Now, is he more hypervigilant today as he's sitting here in court, or less hypervigilant than on the day of August 20th, 1989? He's less hypervigilant to the specific cues that pertain to August the 20th, 1989. So he's less hypervigilant to those cues? Correct. But otherwise, he's equally hypervigilant? In my opinion, yes. And equally likely to misinterpret cues? No. Why not? Because the source of cues that were related to his traumatic past no longer exist. So, because the source is or has been shot to death, he is no longer capable of misinterpreting cues? No, he could be capable of misinterpreting cues, but not in the exact same way as he was before. Not in the same way. Because he's not going to think that Jose Menendez is going to do something to him. Is that correct? Yes. But he can still misinterpret cues just as much today, just different cues. Is that correct? Yes. And what is the response to the misinterpretation of cues? I'm going to object as vague in general. The court says, do you understand the question? The witness says, I understand the general context of the question. The court says, okay, go ahead. The witness says, you want me to answer it? Mr. Conn says, yes. The witness says, yeah, the response to cues? Yes, says Mr. Conn. The witness says, it depends on the particular cue. Mr. Conn says, uh-huh. The witness says, okay, for example, one of the things that was reported to me by Mr. Erik Menendez is an example of his hypervigilance to a specific cue. Is he described one occasion in the jail in which a trustee yelled at him in a loud voice about him not properly disposing of a piece of paper. And his description to me was that he became extremely distressed and upset, that his heart began to beat, and he started to breathe quickly, and he was afraid something was going to happen to him, that he was afraid that trustee was going to do something to him. And his association in his mind was that what was going to happen is this trustee was going to do something like his father used to do. Now, this is a misinterpretation of a cue. The trustee is not its father, yet his behavioral response was very much the same: increased arousal, heartbeat, fear. Something is going to happen to me. Mr. Conn says, even though he had that increased arousal, he was still able to think and reason. Is that correct? Yes. And he didn't respond with violence because even though he was in the hypervigilant aroused state, he said, there's no danger there. This is not my father. There's no reason to respond with violence. Is that correct? Sure. So people who suffer from PTSD still have the capacity to reason. Is that correct? Yes. And those symptoms which are listed there on the board completes the symptoms that are recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as the symptoms associated with PTSD. Is that correct? Yes. And it doesn't say that one of the symptoms of PTSD is that there's a tendency to kill people. No, certainly not. And one of the symptoms of PTSD is not going shopping for shotguns, is it? It doesn't say that in the book. Now, it was your opinion that the defendant was hypervigilant at the time of the crime. Is that correct? Yes. And what is it that's based on? What is it based on? Yes. It's based on his description and his report to me of what happened. Is there any independent information based by which you can verify that Erik Menendez was experiencing this hypervigilance on August the 20th of 1989? Independent? Not that I'm aware of. Okay, so for this feature of hypervigilance, you're relying exclusively on the report of Erik Menendez. Is that correct? I'm relying on the report of Erik Menendez and the entire history of my understanding and my experience of his particular symptoms, his hypervigilance, and his entire trauma history. Correct. And if you are incorrect about that trauma history, if Erik Menendez had never been molested by anyone, your conclusion that the defendant was hypervigilant at the time of the crime would be incorrect. Is that correct? Are you asking that in a hypothetical sense? Yes. I think Ms. Abrams or somebody should have objected to this because I don't think that that's an appropriate question. But the witness answers yes, he could have been hypervigilant from something else besides sexual molestation. So he could have been still hypervigilant. So the hypervigilance then is not dependent, you're saying, upon the sexual molestation. Is that correct? I think, are you talking about Erik Menendez now or yes, Erik Menendez? I think his hypervigilance is related to a number of things. I think first and foremost, it is related to his history of sexual molestation. I think that is a big factor. There are other factors as well. He's hypervigilant to other things in his past besides his relationship with his father. He was hypervigilant to his mother's behavior as well. He was hypervigilant to many cues in both his parents' behavior towards him. It's not just the father. But I'm saying, to be very clear, I really think the strongest connection in terms of learned trauma response of Mr. Erik Menendez really comes first and foremost from the sexual molestation. But as I've testified previously, that also occurred in the context of a traumatic environment in which there were repeated episodes of other kinds of experiences that led to trauma learning, a trauma specific learning of cues connected to hypervigilance, cues that signal a variety of possible adverse or negative consequences to him as well. He was always constantly looking at Jose to see if he was in trouble, to see if Jose was in a good mood or a bad mood, to see what kind of mood Jose was going to be in after that tennis match that you lost. Were you going to get molested that night or not? That's the kind of thing that poor Erik was worrying about at home. The doctor says, "Is there a way that you can I'm sorry. Mr. Conn says, "Doctor, is there a way that you can objectively verify that Erik Menendez was experiencing hypervigilance on August the 20th of 1989 other than by his claim to you concerning what had happened that day?" I don't think so. Now let's talk about the concept of hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is essentially a survival mechanism. Is that correct? It's part of a complex survival mechanism? Yes, it is, indeed. People who are exposed to danger become alert to danger to avoid harm coming to themselves. Is that what the theory is behind it? It's partly that, Mr. Conn, and also it's very adaptive in the sense that if you become aware of potential threats or dangers to yourself or to others in the environment, it's adaptive to be able to recognize the presence of those kinds of cues that signal threat to you so that you might be in a position to respond more effectively or more adaptively to try to prevent that negative trauma thing or negative threatening or injurious thing from occurring to you. Well, as a result of this adaptive or survival mechanism, which you call hypervigilance, people interpret cues or perceive cues faster and more accurately than the non hypervigilant populations. Is that true? Some do, some don't. Well, there have been studies which demonstrate that hypervigilance results in the more accurate perception of information. Is that correct? Yes. How many studies were conducted which demonstrated in a laboratory setting that hypervigilance results in more accurate perception of information rather than the contrary? I don't know, says the witness. Mr. Conn says, "Well, you testified previously to a number of studies that you," yes, he says, the witness. Mr. Conn continues that you demonstrated, let me finish the question. You testified previously to a number of studies that demonstrated the hypervigilance results in a more accurate perception of information. Is that correct? Yes. What type of studies were they? These were psychophysiological studies done in an experimental context in a laboratory. Can you explain the type of studies that were conducted? Sure. There's a whole series of studies by Blanchard and his associates at the University of New York, Albany, and other places that looked first and foremost at an experimental paradigm in a laboratory at the speed of perceptual recognition and the accuracy of recognition of certain trauma related cues. Now, these early sets of studies were done on Vietnam combat veterans, and they had matched controls in the experimental study in terms of the basic scientific program or paradigm. You have you have an identified study population, persons who have been diagnosed with post traumatic stress disorder. And in this particular sample that they were using in a series of about a dozen studies in the 80s, they started with Vietnam combat veterans who had a diagnosis of PTSD. In fact, many of these were patients at veterans at the VA hospitals. They then compared their responses in a laboratory setting to other patients who were also veterans who did not have post traumatic stress disorder. So you have some experimental or scientific controls comparing one group to another group. Now, the basic paradigm was relatively simple. That is, they could use trauma related stimuli cues. Now, for this population of war veterans, these were things like slides that contained pictures from the Vietnam War or auditory sounds of gunfire, a machine gun fire, the sounds of an M16 rifle, or the sounds of a helicopter, maybe, that was used in the Vietnam War. These are auditory sounds or stimuli. What they were looking at in these studies was to see if the group that had PTSD had a faster perceptual recognition threshold. That's just a fancy way of saying could they get it faster and quicker in comparison to the controlled group that did not have PTSD, and those studies showed, in fact, that was the case. Mr. Conn asks, these studies were conducted not only with Vietnam veterans, but studies were also conducted with victims of motor vehicle accidents. Is that correct? Yes. Those studies revealed the same thing, that is, the person who was hypervigilant tended to interpret information more accurately than the non hypervigilant person. Is that correct? Yes, it's partially correct. Is that Mr. Conn speaking or is that a question? I guess this is continued Mr. Conn speaking. The only addition I would add to that, I don't know why I put Mr. Conn. Oh, sorry. Mr. Conn is the prosecutor. He's addressing Mr. Conn. Okay. I was confused. He says, yes, it's partially correct. Mr. Conn, the only addition I would add is the trauma stimuli specific. It is trauma stimuli specific. So just like the Vietnam combat vets, people who had been in motor vehicle accidents that were very injurious, when you compare that to the matched control who didn't have the experience, they, like the Vietnam veterans, have a faster, especially acoustical stimulus recognition threshold. They hear these sounds, recognize them, and identify them more quickly than the group that's not had that experience. That shows the trauma specific conditioning of that particular form of hypervigilance. So basically, let's say you've got your group of hypervigilant combat war veterans, and then you've got your non hypervigilant group. They're going to be played the helicopter sounds, right? And the group that is hypervigilant is going to identify that's a blah blah helicopter from blah blah Vietnam, blah blah, where I was stationed, blah blah. They're going to know all those specific details are going to come back to them in a split second. Whereas the people who aren't hypervigilant, it's going to take them a little bit longer to recognize it. They might still recognize it. Some of them might not, even if they don't have that trauma related to that stimuli, is basically what he's saying. Some of them might not recognize it, or that it may take them a lot longer to recognize it because they weren't looking for it. They're at one point in time, they weren't fearful of everything around them. And there has been at least a dozen studies which consistently reveal that the hypervigilant person interprets cues more accurately rather than misinterprets cues. Is that correct? When they are when they are trauma specific. Mr. Conn says, and no studies reveal the opposite, that the hypervigilant population is less accurate in their perception or they distort stimuli. Is that correct? Well, actually, I don't know that the studies have looked at whether or not distortion exists in that way. That's the way in which it was conducted in the laboratory. Did you previously testify that there are no studies which reveal that the hypervigilant population is less accurate in their perception or they distort stimuli? Yes. Is that true? As far as I know, that's true. Now, is there a relationship between PTSD and the killings of one's parents? I don't understand your question. That is, does post traumatic stress disorder cause a person to kill his parents? No. And there have been, you said that approximately 1 out of 5 people will suffer from post traumatic stress disorder in the course of their life. What I said was, in the course of a lifetime, when we look at people who have developed PTSD at any point in their life cycle, roughly about 1 out of every 5 Americans has a risk factor for for getting post traumatic stress. I don't know. Okay, it says for getting being. That's what the transcript says. So I'm just gonna say whatever. A risk factor of 1 out of 5 will, in fact, suffer from PTSD. Yeah, someone during their life or sometime during their lifetime. Okay, but there's no expectation that 1 out of 5 people will kill their parents or commit homicide, is there? No. Does PTSD increase the dangerousness of a person in and of itself? Ms. Abramson says, excuse me, I'm going to object to the question under 352. The court says, could you clarify what it is that you mean? Mr. Conn says, yes. Does post traumatic stress disorder cause a person to become more dangerous? Same objection, Your Honor. In what context? Says the court. Mr. Conn says, in other words, does it make a person homicidal? Same objection, Your Honor. Overruled. The witness says, does PTSD make a person more homicidal in and of itself? No. Mr. Conn says, any causal relationship between PTSD and homicides? Yes. What is that relationship? We have several studies that have looked at the relationship between PTSD and homicides, particularly in the Vietnam veteran population. And in these studies that have been done, when you look at those men who have committed either homicides or other forms of aggressive assault, there is, in fact, a strong statistical relationship between one, the severity of their post traumatic stress disorder, and the disposition to engage in aggressive, including homicidal activity. There is a correlation. Now, I want to qualify that because those studies are referring to a war veteran population with post traumatic stress. That's where we have that data at this time. That data does show there is a relationship between PTSD and the disposition to engage in aggressive, including homicidal behavior. Now, you understand, says Mr. Conn, that Erik Menendez is not a Vietnam veteran, correct? Are there any statistics that show that someone suffering from PTSD, that there's a causal relationship between PTSD and homicide outside of the Vietnam's experience or the veteran's experience? As far as I know, in terms of literature, I don't know any published study at this time that shows that relationship. I wonder if there is one today. Let me find out. So I asked AI, and yes, there's a vast body of published literature that examines the link between PTSD and violent or aggressive tendencies using populations entirely separate from Vietnam veterans. I'm sure at the time there were not as many books about this, but this just goes to show we learn and we grow and the science changes. So why are they still in prison? Is what I want to know. The science has changed. The science, we know more about the causal relationship and things. So, not that they get a free pass, that's not what I'm saying, but we know these things now, and it should factor into, was it a manslaughter or a homicide charge? And I still to this day believe it should have been manslaughter, in my opinion. And they would have been out by now if that had happened. Next question. Okay, and so a person who's been in a car crash and who suffers from PTSD is no more inclined to commit a homicide as a result of that experience than the person who is either in a crash or who does not suffer from PTSD. Is that correct? Insofar as we know, that would be true. And the person who was molested and who's suffering from PTSD is no more inclined to commit homicide as a result of that experience that the person who's neither been molested or who does not suffer from PTSD. Is that correct? No, I wouldn't say that's true. Why not? Because there are studies that have looked at the relationship between the history of abuse and particularly parricide. meaning killing parents, parasite. And one of the things that I found interesting in searching the database, looking at homicides and looking at parasite as a form of that is that in the majority of cases where we have studies, empirical studies looking at people who in fact committed homicide in the homicide of a parent in particular, which emerged in these various studies that I summarized before coming here, is a history of childhood sexual abuse. So the studies and cases that he's looked at in the past where there's parricide, meaning killing of their parents, children killing their parents. Basically, we know now that those cases are interrelated to childhood sexual abuse. Many of them likely had severe abuse happening in their lives. Childhood abuse, sexual abuse, things of that nature. So, kids who were in similar situations to Erik and Lyle, probably. Well, what does that have to do with post traumatic stress disorder? Asks Mr. Conn. The witness says, well, if you have a significant history of childhood sexual abuse, the risk probability of you having post traumatic stress disorder is very high. But that information there doesn't tell you whether or not those persons were suffering from post traumatic stress disorder, does it? Well, let me look. I think there's at least one or two studies that may have made that determination. Give me just a second. The witness reads something. In looking through the study, it doesn't appear, at least on this cursory look, that they related specific diagnosis. The studies were more likely to look at the histories of the abuse in the people that committed the parricide. Mr. Khan says, so the person who has been sexually abused and is suffering from PTSD is not necessarily, at least the statistics do not bear out that those people are more inclined to commit homicide than the person who has not been abused. Is that correct? No, I think that would be a misstatement, the way that you phrased that. Why is that? Because you said the statistic don't don't bear it out. You said the statistics don't bear it out. I think that's a mischaracterization of what's in these studies. And that is to say that there's clearly a relationship in these studies reported between childhood sexual abuse and parricide. What isn't clear is whether or not we know the prevalence rate or of PTSD in these studies because they're not reported as it pertains to the history of the childhood sexual abuse and how that in turn relates to the parricide because it's not indicated in the studies. And that is where my boyfriend just came home. And so I'm going to stop here, but I am going to finish this up tomorrow. You'll see me probably feeling better. I'm still recovering mostly from this POTS, whatever. It's been a bad flare up from the bad weather. We had Canada, uh, wildfire particulates in the air. So the last few days have been hazardous air quality days and also, like hot, like 90 degrees. So it just really triggered some stuff with me. So hopefully I'm feeling better tomorrow and I can get through this better. I'm struggling if you can't tell. So hopefully when I'm back just in a second for you, it'll be better for me. I'm back. And it's like 2 days later. I had another bad day. So, oh well, whatever. We're still going to get it done. So, sorry. Anyways, let's continue on. So, we left off in the middle of Cross of Dr. John Wilson. And the next question is all right, well, that's what the focus of my question is not so much whether people who are abused tend to commit parricide, but whether people who have been abused and who suffer from post traumatic stress disorder have a greater tendency to commit homicide than people who are abused, but who do not suffer from PTSD. Yeah, says Dr. Wilson. Good question. And the answer is that we don't know the answer to that yet. Right? Right. Right. So there's no evidence one way or the other. Is that correct? No, I think there's evidence. I wouldn't say that. I think there is evidence, certainly, that's very indicative that if a person has a history of childhood sexual abuse, that's much more likely to be involved in this kind of parasital homicide. What we don't have is the question you just asked. Do we know the relationship between that history and how many people get PTSD and how many people then commit parricide? That data we don't have yet. And you said that 26.5% of the Vietnam veterans that come back from Vietnam came back with PTSD sometime in their life, sometime in their lifetime. Yes. So it didn't mean that they came back with it right away. It could have developed a little bit later on, it seems. How many of those went to commit homicide? Do you know? A good question, Mr. Conn. Unfortunately, we don't have accurate data on that. The studies that have been done at the VA hospitals have indicated, Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, at this point, I am going to object to this line of questioning. I think under 352, I think this is confusing. Overruled, says the court. The witness says, yeah, the studies that we do have on that question between returning Vietnam vets with PTSD who have committed homicide, the studies that have been done for the Menlo Park VA hospital show a proportionately high number of those men admitted to that hospital as patients, inpatients, have been involved in not only criminal activity, but engaged in homicidal activity. A proportionately high number. We'll leave it at that. Mr. Conn says, well, that's what I'm asking you. Of that 26.5% of the veterans that came back from Vietnam, how many of those became killers? I would object to the form of the question, Your Honor. Rephrase the question. Mr. Conn says, how many of those committed homicide? We don't have the accurate data at this time. Do you have any idea? Is there any data available to you? Ms. Abramson says, I would object. Calling for speculation, Your Honor, in this area. The court says there is no accurate data. Mr. Conn says, you would agree, sir, that there's going to be a very, very small number of those Vietnam veterans who went on to commit homicide, regardless of whether or not they were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Is that correct? Your Honor, says Ms. Abramson, I am going to object that this calls for speculation. He just said there's no data. Overruled, says the court. The witness says, please repeat the question for me. Yes, says Mr. Conn. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Wilson, that of the 26.5% of Vietnam veterans who came back with PTSD, there was only going to be a very, very tiny number of those who committed homicide upon their return? I don't know how to answer your question because I don't know what you mean by tiny number. All right, I'll withdraw that question, doctor. Now, for some people who have been in car crashes and become more hypervigilant, what type of cues do they look for? What kind of cues do they look for? You mean after the crash? Yes. They look for cues that suggest that they may be in a situation where it could happen again. Sorry, doggy interruptions. Okay. And is there a greater increase in the statistics, or is there a statistical difference for the number of people? Let me rephrase that. For the people who have been in car crashes and who suffer from PTSD, do those people tend to commit homicide more frequently than the people who have not been in such car crashes? I don't know. I don't have any data. Well, you have no reason to believe that people who suffer from PTSD as a result of car crashes become more homicidal, do you? I wouldn't expect it. No. A car crash, a one time incident, is much different than repeated abuse by someone who is supposed to be your protector and your caretaker. Or people who suffer from post traumatic stress disorder as a result of other kinds of traumatic experiences, you wouldn't expect them to become more homicidal, would you? Your Honor, the record should reflect there is a continuing objection on this line of questioning under 352 as misleading, says Ms. Abramson. The court says the record won't reflect that. The record will reflect that you have just made an objection, which is now overruled. Ms. Abramson says, well, I don't want to object each time a question like this is asked. The court says, what you are saying is now you want to object to future questions along this line, not the previous questions you have already been asked without objection. Oh, I objected once in a while, but yes, Your Honor. The court says, all right, I understand. Ms. Amerson says, okay, thank you, Your Honor. The court says, your next question, please. He's such a douche. I'm sorry, but he just treats Ms. Abramson with such disrespect in front of the jury, which is very prejudicial. You're not supposed to do that. All right, so Mr. Conn says, yes, for people who have suffered from other forms of trauma other than car crashes and suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, are there statistics which show those people tend to become more homicidal? As far as I know, I don't think we have any type of that data. I don't think we have any data of that type. Do you have so you have no reason to believe then that such people become homicidal, correct? Based on having available scientific data, correct. I might have reasons to think differently for clinical and theoretical reasons. Okay. Now, you said that in regard to hypervigilance in determining whether or not Erik Menendez had hypervigilance on August the 20th, you rely exclusively on this self-report. Is that correct? Objection misstates the testimony. Overruled. The witness says, no, that's not what I'm saying. I said I did rely on that, but there are a lot of other things. And I think if you remember, my answer was I relied upon the entire trauma history as reported to me by Mr. Menendez. I relied on my evaluation of other information I had available from other witnesses, other documents, other sources, other evaluations that's been done. That is the totality of information that I looked at that helped me come to that opinion besides just what Erik told me. Well, what I'm saying to you is that putting aside the testimony of or the claims of Erik concerning himself being hypervigilant on that date, you cannot determine just from the other information that Erik Menendez was necessarily hypervigilant on August the 20th of 1989, can you? No. Okay, all right. And counsel asked you a number of questions concerning the events of August the 20th, and you said in regard to a number of the events that the court says if we're going to go, if we're going to go into that right now, then perhaps we should, this would be a good time to take our recess before we get to another area of inquiry. We will resume at 25 after the hour. Don't discuss the matter. Don't form any final opinions about it. We will resume after 25 minutes or 25 after. The court says, now we're back. The court says everyone is present. Do we have something to discuss before the jury comes back? Mr. Conn says there is one thing. So Mr. Conn says we would like to once again raise the issue of the reference to, yes, perhaps we should close the court. It's more on the topic that we discussed earlier. So there was some molestation charges in another household that wasn't the Menendez home. So it's not going to be an open court to protect the identities and everything for confidentiality reasons, obviously. So they closed the cameras and everything and closed the courtroom. Now we're back. The jury enters the room. The court says, all right, you may continue your examination. Mr. Conn says, yes, doctor, concerning the events of August the 20th of 1989, you testified to a number of things that the defendant did that are consistent with the finding of PTSD. Do you remember that? Yes. What a dumb question. In fact, if we can go back even before August the 20th, your attention was directed, I believe, to the prior incident where Jose Menendez was said to have come to the door of the defendant's bedroom and the defendant sat on his bed with a shotgun and just kind of froze. Do you remember that? Yes. And I believe you expressed an opinion in regard to that incident that that behavior on that part of the defendant was consistent with PTSD. Do you remember that? Yes. All right. Now, if the defendant had not frozen and if the defendant had responded in a violent manner, opening the door and shooting his father to death, would that also be consistent with PTSD? It would be. Okay, so either one is consistent with PTSD, is that correct? Yes, in terms of fight and flight, that's correct. Okay, and so the fact that the defendant froze doesn't prove that the defendant was suffering from PTSD, is that correct? Are you asking just that response in itself? Correct. No, it doesn't prove that he had post traumatic stress disorder. Because post traumatic stress is basically the effects of stress under stress, is that right? Yes. So when you say that certain types of behavior is consistent with PTSD, you're not suggesting that that piece of evidence alone proves PTSD, are you? No, I'm not. And then later, when you spoke about the defendant's actions on Sunday, August the 20th of 1989, you said, for example, that Erik firing all of the rounds, all of the shotgun rounds in that room is consistent with PTSD. Is that correct? I believe I said it was consistent with the panic state that he was in at the time that he had discharged the gun. Okay. Would firing the rounds be consistent with PTSD? Firing the rounds in the way that it was indicated that there was a total of discharge of a total discharge of the gun. All the shells were expended in a rapid fashion with the testimony, and that was consistent with being in a panic state as a condition of post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. Do you understand the question that I'm now asking? I'm asking you, would firing all of the rounds be consistent with PTSD? Yes. And would firing just one round be consistent with PTSD? I don't know. You say that in regard to the defendant feeling numb afterwards, after the shooting, you said that that was consistent with post traumatic stress disorder. Yes, it is. Would not feeling numb after the shooting, that is still being pumped up, would that be consistent with PTSD? It could be, yes. And you were asked a question whether falling apart, the defendant was emotionally falling apart, as you said, after going to the movies and getting the theater tickets. I asked if that was consistent with PTSD. Do you remember that? Yes. And would not falling apart at that point in time be also consistent with PTSD? I don't think so. Why would that not be consistent? Not falling apart? Yes. That someone could be totally composed and calm and not have a distressed reaction? I'm not saying being totally composed. I am saying that if the person did not totally fall apart, if the person was still in a hyper state at that point in time, would that be consistent with PTSD? I don't know what your question is. That's funny. Okay, my question is this. Are you saying that following a shooting such as took place on August the 20th, that there is only one particular way that a person suffering from PTSD would have responded in that situation? No, that's a good question. There is a lot of different ways that a person could have responded to that situation. Right. And so if you go through the movements of the defendant that is claimed by this defendant concerning his behavior, you can see, or you can say that each and every movement that he claimed is consistent with PTSD. Is that correct? You could say that, yes. But for each and every one of those movements, you can also give an alternative movement and say that that movement or that particular course of action is also consistent with PTSD. Is that correct? Your Honor, I'm going to object as compound and argumentative. The court says it's not compound, but do you understand the question? The witness says not quite. I think I know where he's going, but it isn't totally clear to me. Court says, okay, then re-ask the question. Mr. Conn says, in other words, for example, going to the movies and purchasing theater tickets to be used for an alibi, is that consistent with PTSD? It may or may not be. Okay. And why do you say that it may not be consistent? Because buying a ticket in and of itself may not have any meaning other than buying a ticket. There may be another reason for buying the ticket that's unrelated to the PTSD. So many of the reasons taken by the defendant, which he said he took following the shooting, could be totally unrelated to PTSD. Is that correct? Are you asking? Objection. Never mind. I'll withdraw it, says Ms. Abramson. When it says, are you asking that in a hypothetical sense? Yes, it's possible. Okay, and thereby purchasing theater tickets does not prove that the defendant was suffering from PTSD, does it? It does not. But when you put it all together, it's a big picture. You have to look at the whole picture. You can't that's what this state keeps doing, is like picking one little thing after another, like, well, does this mean that the abuse happened? It doesn't? Okay. Well, then it obviously didn't. So that's our argument. This is ridiculous. Yes, there's other alternative reasons for everything. But Erik has been consistent, Lyle has been consistent, at least in the telling of the abuse and things like that in preparation of this trial. Before, they obviously lied about it because they didn't want to talk about it, and then it came out. But that's a reason why the state thinks that they're making it up. Okay, and because anyone could have shot their parents without suffering from PTSD and gone out and purchased theater tickets following such a shooting. Is that correct? Objection calls for speculation. That must be Ms. Abramson, even though it says Mr. Conn, and the court overrules it, of course. The witness says, sure. Mr. Conn says, in picking up the shotgun shells immediately after the shooting, that doesn't prove one way or the other that the defendant was suffering from PTSD, does it? Correct. Okay, and driving around to meet with Perry Berman and get an alibi, that doesn't prove that the defendant was suffering from PTSD, does it? Correct. Now, you said, doctor, that Jose Menendez controlled every aspect of the defendant's life. Is that correct? Just about every aspect of his life. That's correct. And this caused him to have a helpless sense of himself. Is that correct? Yes. Well, Dr. Wilson, was Jose Menendez? Ms. Abramson says, I would object to that. Court says, okay, sustained. Ask your next question, please. Got a sustained finally. Mr. Conn says, was Jose Menendez controlling the life of Erik Menendez when Erik Menendez went to San Diego to purchase the shotguns? I would answer that question as psychologically, yes. You said that he structured his whole life. Wasn't that what you said? Yes. Was he structuring his life that day? In my opinion, yes, psychologically he was. Okay, but did he have a specific plan for what Erik Menendez was supposed to do that Friday when Erik went to purchase shotguns in San Diego? I don't know. Well, were you told in any of the information that you received during your work on this case that Jose had a specific plan of action for Erik that day, and Erik violated that plan of action and instead went down to San Diego and purchased shotguns? No, not that I'm aware of. So he was not structuring his day. That is his conduct on that particular day, was he? Not that I'm aware of. And it's your understanding that Erik Menendez was free to come and go on Friday, the day that he decided to go down and purchase shotguns to kill his parents. Yes. And on Saturday, when he went to purchase ammunition, did you have any information that Jose Menendez had structured that day for him? The only structure for that day that I can recall was the planning of the fishing trip. And other than that, there was no structure for that day that interfered with Erik's plans to go out and purchase some additional ammunition. As far as I know, that's correct. As far as Erik Menendez seeking to go and practice with a shotgun so that he could shoot his parents accurately, Ms. Abramson says, I'm going to object to that, Your Honor, misstates the testimony. Rephrase the question, says the court. Okay, says Mr. Conn. As far as Mr. Menendez practicing with the shotgun on that particular day, Were there any plans of Jose Menendez for the structure of that particular day that would interfere with Erik Menendez's plans to practice with the shotgun? Not that I'm aware of. I have no further questions, Your Honor. Any redirect? You bet. There's going to be some redirect. So we are going to begin redirect. It's probably going to end the day with him still in redirect, just FYI. All right, Ms. Abramson says, Dr. Wilson, how many pages of interview notes do you have of our conversations with Mr. Menendez? Roughly about 260. And in those pages of interviews, did you repeatedly question him about the facts and circumstances surrounding his panic reaction killing of his parents? Yes. Did you go back to that topic on different days and approach it from different perspectives to see if he would be consistent in the way that he reported his feelings and his observations of those days leading up to the shootings? Yes, I did. Did you also compare that 260 plus pages of notes with the notes that were generated by Dr. Vickery over the course of a 4 or 5 month series of interviews that Dr. Vickery conducted with Mr. Menendez in 1990? Yes. And were your notes and Dr. Vickery's notes consistent? Yes. Did you also review the findings of other experts who consulted with Mr. Menendez? Yes. And did their findings reveal that they had received from Mr. Menendez consistent information to what you had received? That's correct. So all the information Erik gave him was corroborated by other notes and things along the way. And this is a period stretching over 6 years, correct? Correct. Now, are you aware, Dr. Wilson, that in this trial, Erik Menendez testified that he had, during the commission of a sexual assault upon him by his father, a fantasy of killing his father? Yes. And with respect to the fantasy that's contained in your notes, isn't that fantasy connected to his anticipation because he heard his father coming to his room that he is going to sexually assault him? Yes. And isn't he telling you that at a moment like that, when he knows that he's about to be sexually assaulted, he had a fantasy of killing his father with a tennis racket? Objection leading. Smashing him in the head? Objection leading. The court says, objection sustained. Oh, of course it is. Objection to the form of the question is sustained. Ms. Abramson says, what was the specific context of the fantasy that you noted on one page, page 14 of tablet 1 of your 260 pages of notes? He had fantasies of killing him with a tennis racket. He was going to smash his head. He heard footsteps on the floors. The floors would crack and he would freeze from fear, indicating that his father was coming to his room. So the sounds, first of all, of his father's footsteps he reported to you in the past had caused him to freeze with fear? Yes. And the sounds of those footsteps, I take it, occasionally would cause him to fantasize, what if I could stop him? What if I could smash him? Objection leading and argumentative. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, did he explain to you it was it was thought process? Yes. Did he explain to you it was thought process? Okay. And when you turn to the question that you asked him, oh, and did he put this in time? Was this a particular age when he remembered? In talking to you over these 30 some odd hours that he had such a fantasy? I believe this was when he was young, around 11. So 15 years old when he's in the county jail and you administer a test to him. Oh, sorry, 15 years later, not 15 years old. 15 years later, when he's in his 20s, he's in the county jail and you administer a test to him. Was the question on that test, did you have a feeble fantasy of killing your father when he was about to molest you? The answer, no. Did this test question, was it couched in terms of serious thoughts? It says specifically, have there been times when you felt like seriously harming or even killing someone? And so the word seriously appears in the question. Yes. And to that question, he said no. Yes. Now, with respect to the questions of the testing having to do with anger, well, let me just get to this for a second. There was, on this particular test, I think it was the TSI, where these issues came up. Yes. And this is the test with 100 questions, correct? Correct. And there are a number of different questions for each of the what you call scales. There are symptom clusters of PTSD and symptom clusters of related types of mental conditions. That's correct. Associated are they called what? Um Features, he says features of the disorder as listed in the DSM-4. Yes. Associated features, and one of the most common associated features for people who have been traumatized by people they love is depression, is it not? It is. And that's true whether the person is a battered wife, a molested child, an abused elderly, anyone who is harmed by a person they trusted or loved. Correct. Depression is a very common fallout. Yes. So, in the group of different people who have been studied, where PTSD has been found to be prevalent, groups of traumatized people, does depression tend to show up more for the battered woman and the abused children than it does for the auto accident victims? Yes. Thank you for clarifying that, as if we didn't, common sense should dictate years of abuse versus a one time thing is going to be a lot more traumatizing. Not to say that the trauma isn't real and doesn't feel real to the person having PTSD after a car crash. It's, I get it. I used to get nervous around the areas where people crashed into me. It was like a 5-car pileup. I was the second one to the front. So I didn't get it as bad as I could have, but it still totaled my car. And I was pissed about that. Anyways, it used like going by that area, like I still remember it. My body still like clenches thinking about like I had a clench right there because I saw it coming. So not to say that I have full on PTSD, that's just a memory. You know what I mean? So imagine someone who really does have full on PTSD. Is there a difference in which symptom clusters and which associated features are most prevalent depending on what kind of trauma the person has received? Absolutely. Is there a difference with the frequency of certain symptoms versus other equally valid PTSD symptoms if the trauma has been chronic? Yes. What does chronic mean? Chronic means ongoing. It continues. It has not abated. The illness is persistent. What about chronic trauma? Meaning repeated. Yes. Is there a difference in the types of symptom clusters, the specific symptoms within the clusters that you would expect to find with someone who has been traumatized within their home for 12 years versus someone who was in a bad earthquake? Yes. What respect to that, to the type of trauma that you found Erik had suffered from, was his PTSD profile consistent with the profiles of people traumatized in a similar way? Yes. Now, on the questions, the TSI, first of all, when you gave him this particular test, yes. You read 100 questions to him, correct. And the questions that all deal with the same topic are not clustered together on this test. No, they're all mixed up in the 100 items. And with respect, for example, to the questions of irritability and anger, he could have answered each of these never? Yes. Or he could have answered them with a 1. Yes. Meaning more than never. Yes. With a 2 meaning slightly less often. Slightly less than often. Yes. Or with a 3, which meant often. Correct. Did he answer all of the questions, all of the anger questions with a never? No. Did he answer those questions with ones and twos? Yes. So he was indicating that he wasn't trying to proclaim that he was a person who's never been angry. Correct. Wasn't trying to claim that he's never been irritable. Correct. He wasn't trying to portray himself as Mother Teresa. Now, the homicidality questions, I believe there were only 2 of those. Is that correct? Yes. And remind me, what were the numbers on those? I don't have a copy of the test in front of me. I think it's number 25. That's homicidality is on the homicidality is on the caps, Ms. Abramson. You're with the TSI. It's not even on that one. She says, "All right. You testified in July in this courtroom in what you've called an 801 hearing." That's correct. And did an expert witness named Jacqueline Campbell also testify at the hearing? Objection irrelevant. Overruled. You can answer the question. Yes, she did. And is Jacqueline Campbell a nationally recognized expert in battered women syndrome? Objection irrelevant. Sustained, says the court. Why? Ms. Amerson says, and was the purpose of that hearing, as you understood it, to determine whether or not syndromes existed to describe the psychological effects of child abuse and molestation on people who were no longer children? Yes. Was that the purpose, as you understood it, of the hearing? Yes. Now, have there been, over the last 12 years, an increasing number of studies and papers and books concerning the effects of domestic violence in all of its forms on different populations? Yes. What does different populations mean in that context? Different trauma populations, which refers to children who have had various forms of abuse, interpersonal violence in the context of a family, spousal abuse, or domestic abuse. It can also refer to urban violence, in which there is violence among gangs, violence among neighborhoods, and other forms of interpersonal violence between people. Okay, interpersonal violence is one type of trauma that can cause post traumatic stress disorder. That's correct. It can also cause, can it not, clusters of symptoms that are not caused PTSD that are called syndromes. Correct. What is the basic difference for diagnostic purposes from labeling a person PTSD versus battered person, battered woman, child, whatever person syndrome? What's the distinction? Well, there's 2 distinctions. One is that some of the people who have had these experiences of interpersonal violence may not meet the precise definition of post traumatic stress disorder. They may have some of the symptoms, but not all. But they may have other symptoms as well, symptoms about injury to their sense of self esteem and self worth, depression, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. So you can have overlap between the 2 conditions, but one does not necessarily mean that you have the other. Or alternatively, you can have both. You could have post-traumatic stress disorder and be a battered person or woman, for example. Battered woman, meaning suffered from battered woman syndrome? Correct. Is this particular case, does Erik Menendez have both? Yes. Both PTSD and the syndrome of being the victim of interpersonal violence? Correct. And in assessing him for the syndrome, indicating that he has been the victim of interpersonal violence, does that indicate or does that include all of the damages to the self that you have described? It does. I think you've said that. According to the DSM-4, PTSD per se does not include that set of symptoms that reveal damage to the self? Correct. And it is that set of symptoms that deal with the damage to the self that Dr. Herman, Judith Herman, would include in what she calls PTSD. Correct. or PTSD plus. Correct. Now, would it be fair to say that many who suffer from battered person syndrome, whether it's the battered child or the battered woman or the battered elderly, miss that one symptom cluster of PTSD called re-experiencing the trauma? Yes. And if that piece is missing, it is appropriate to diagnose them for PTSD? No, they don't meet the B criterion. But if they have everything else, all the other symptom clusters for PTSD, is that is it then that they would be diagnosed as having the battered person syndrome? That's correct. Now, with respect to the research concerning the results of interpersonal violence over the years, have there been a group of researchers, say in the cluster, studying women in these situations in domestic violence and studying what happens to them, what their perceptions are, what their behaviors are, what the psychological effects or damage to this is from battering relationships? Yes. And then was there or has there been another cluster of people who have been looking at children? Yes. Studying what happens to them in childhood? Yes. And then is there another group of people, including Dr. Briere, who designed the TS1, who have been studying a group called Adult Survivors of Molestation? Yes. And is it with respect to the adult survivors of childhood molestation that the term battered person syndrome is now being used? Correct. Rather than adult survivors of childhood abuse? Yes. Just a simple label. Yes. Have you heard, or sorry, have the symptoms and effects of child abuse that persist into adulthood been well known and studied for many years? Yes. And looking all over, in looking all of the fields of research, the children in childhood, the women, the adult survivors of childhood abuse, do they over the spectrum demonstrate repeatedly the same clusters of psychological symptoms as a result of being abused? Remarkably so. And you made reference to Dr. Stuart Hart's research. Dr. Hart focused on showing that the same symptoms of abuse exist even when there's no physical component to the abuse. Yes. What's known as psychological maltreatment in its various forms? Objection irrelevant. The court says, I'll let you get this one answer in. The witness says, the answer is, Ms. Amerson says, now can you, in the research on post-traumatic stress disorder, even are there numbers? Well, first of all, let me ask you this. How many people have you evaluated over the course of your career specializing in PTSD or that disorder? How many separate people? Around me, 10,000 maybe. 10,000 people. Maybe a little more. You gotta love a confident witness when they come back and you don't want to ask a question you don't know the answer to, but that's what this state's attorney just did, Mr. Conn. No, sorry. Why am I still thinking that we're on cross? I keep doing that. Sorry. No, we are on redirect, and she just brought Ms. Abramson, luckily, or not luckily, I'm sure she knew the answer to this, brought this out. She did know the answer to this and wanted to make sure that the jury knew that he had treated maybe 10,000 people with PTSD. So this is not something new to him. This is not something that he isn't familiar with. He is definitely an expert in it, and what he says, I think, should have some weight to the jury here. So she says 10,000 people. He says maybe a little more. Have you been involved in research studies? Sure. And in those research studies, you're required to see a large number of people. Sure. And in fact, in the very first study you ever did, How many people did you evaluate in that very first study 20 years ago? Yeah, it was literally 20 years ago this year. I saw 1,000 Vietnam vets in 9 months. So you have evaluated for various reasons 10,000 people, correct? Or at least 10,000. Yes. Now, do you always find PTSD when you talk to people? No. And if you don't find it, do you tell the truth? Sure. Have you been contacted over the years by attorneys and potential patients and others and asked if you could render an opinion on the expertise of PTSD? Yes. Have you been, or have there been occasions where you could not? Yes. When the person just didn't have it? Yes. And has that been your opinion? Yes. And have there been situations when you could have earned money if you had said yes, they had PTSD and become an expert and been highly paid? Yes. So he could have profited off of a false positive on someone if he wanted to. But here he's showing he's ethical. He didn't do anything like that, but some people might. Um, and you turned it down. Yes. And you believe, Dr. Wilson, that you have a rather unique position in the field of PTSD research. Yes. Do you believe you have a very highly regarded reputation as the leading researcher in America in this field? One of them, yes. And are you prepared to jeopardize that reputation by lying on the witness stand in this courtroom? Never. On another front, you have indicated in response to some questions by Mr. Conn that psychologists, mental health evaluators can be fooled. Yep. And you've worked with some people, in fact, have you not, who have been fooled? Yes. And by fooled, they make a diagnosis and they're later proven one way or another to be wrong, and including a forensic situation, including in situations that involve legal issues, like this one, like this one, including situations such as those referred to in the malingering section of the DSM when there is a potential ulterior benefit from someone being labeled PTSD. Leading, rephrase the question. Would that include situations where the book tells you be extra careful when there's some potential outside source that might make the subject want to lie? Yes. People have been fooled even then. Yes. In the 10,000 cases that you have evaluated, has it ever been demonstrated, Dr. Wilson, that you were fooled? No. Do you think you've been fooled here? No. Do you think you have spent enough time with Erik to be confident in your diagnosis of him and your assessment of what his mental state was at the crucial periods in that week before he shot his parents? I do. Mr. Conn, I pointed out your tenure association on some cases with Mr. Levin. Correct. Mr. Conn pointed out those. Correct. Do you respect Mr. Levin? Absolutely. And what is your opinion of his integrity and honesty? Unimpeachable. And do you know Mr. Levin to be a twice decorated Vietnam War veteran? Objection, irrelevant, no foundation. The court says sustained, sustained. Ms. Abramson says, as it was common interest in the plight of the Vietnam War vets then that originally brought you and Mr. Levin together? Yes. And did you originally contact him for the help of the case in Louisiana or a Vietnam War vet who had been unjustly imprisoned for 16 years? Objection, argumentative, and irrelevant. The court says sustained to the form of the question. Samerson says, was the 9 original contact that you had with Mr. Levin in a legal sense, you're asking him to help a Vietnam War vet who you're asking him to help a Vietnam War vet who had been brought to your attention. Correct. Now, in the cases that you have worked on with Mr. Levin, in the majority of these cases, Has the diagnostic information that you were able to bring to the case been geared towards mitigation? Yes. When Mr. Conn asked you in those cases what was PTSD used as a defense, did you understand what the word defense means? Not in the structural sense. No, I didn't. You understand that the defense in this case is based on a state of mind of fear? Yes. The defense is not PTSD. Correct. Mr. Khan says objection, argumentative. Court says sustained to the form of the question, answer stricken. Ms. Amerson asks, is it your understanding that PTSD in this is the defense in this case? Objection, irrelevant, calls for improper opinion. The court says sustained as to the form of the question. How did I just lose my spot? Did I not? Sustained as to his understanding is what it actually said, and I said the wrong thing, so that's how I lost my spot, because I read something completely different than what was on the page. Right? That's where I was. Is your understanding that PTSD is the defense? Objection. And he says, sustained as to his understanding. Ms. Abramson says, in the cases in which you have been consulted by Mr. Levin, have you always found PTSD? No. In the cases where you have found it, were you testifying in what's known as a penalty phase or a mitigation phase of a case? Objection irrelevant. Overruled. Yes, says the witness. Ms. Amerson says, now you were asked about, do you know Dr. Lenore Walker, by the way? Yes. Do you know whether or not she was consulted in this case? Objection irrelevant, calls for speculation, or hearsay. The court sustains that. Ms. Amerson says, Mr. Conn read to you from her, you understand that The Battered Woman was the first book that she wrote? Yes, on the subject. You understand she's written several since? Yes. And many, many, many articles? Yes. And she's been a pioneer in researching the effects of interpersonal violence on a particular population group, women. Correct. Now, you recall that Mr. Conn read you the manifesto, if you will, that Dr. Walker put into that Dr. Walker put into her very first book. Yes. Is it your understanding, in fact, is it acknowledged by Dr. Walker that in the early days of her research she was taking a feminist perspective? Yes. And with respect to, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I didn't write fast enough to get every word, Dr. Walker's statement that women experience some level of non-responsiveness from the courts and the police in protecting themselves. Do you remember that? I do. And with respect to children, do you believe the courts and the police are capable of protecting children to a greater extent than grown women who can communicate? No. And you recall the second part of Dr. Walker's statement that Mr. Conn read was that society has expectations about women that their place is in some, which implies it's also their place to be obedient, and that it's difficult for grown women, to leave their home. Yes. Do you remember that? I do. How would you characterize the situation of women in this respect from the situation of children in the home? Objection, rephrase the question, or objection irrelevant. And the court says rephrase the question. Ms. Amerson says, is that notion that society expects a woman's place to be in that home even more applicable to children? Objection irrelevant. The court says, in relationship to Dr. Walker's work, is that what you're referring to? Ms. Amerson says, let me back up. Mr. Conn claimed that battered woman syndrome was a label that should be exclusively the province of women because of their dependent state, correct? Yes. Objection misstates the testimony. I didn't make a claim Dr. Lenore Walker said that. I would object to that. Sustained as to the form of the question. Ms. Abramson says, Mr. Conn said. Court says, wait, sustained as to the form of the question. The question and answer is stricken. Ms. Abramson says, Mr. Conn was indicating to you that what was in her book, or Dr. Walker claimed, was the special dependent place of women in our society. Do you remember that? Yes. And that women developed this syndrome because they were dependent and locked in at home and somewhat helpless vis-a-vis men financially and with respect to choices in life. Yes. And that's what that list is all about? Yes. How would you compare the situation of children of these same issues? Objection irrelevant. I haven't finished the question, says Mr. Conn. No, I'm sorry, says Ms. Abramson. I haven't finished the question yet, Mr. Conn. The court says, all right, why don't you finish your whole question? Ms. Abramson says, all right, in your opinion, are these concerns that Dr. Walker expresses with respect to women at all relevant or applicable to children? Objection, says Mr. Conn. There are no children on trial. Irrelevant. Rephrase the question, please, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, based on that objection, Your Honor? Yes. All right. To the children of people who have been abusing them their whole lives, when the children are at the ages of 18 and 21, to the children of people who have been abusing, they're still the children of people who, yeah, I get what she's saying. Like, they're still children in the sense that they were the children of Jose and Kitty. Mr. Conn says, objection argumentative if phrased. The court says, do you understand the question? He says, yes, I do. The court says, okay, you may answer it. The witness says that they're equally as vulnerable. Ms. Abramson says, in your understanding of the research that Dr. Walker did with respect to battered woman syndrome, she was looking at women who wound up in romantic relationships commencing in adulthood. Yes. And were these women that she was studying who had developed battered women syndrome, as far as you know, the women, or were most of them over the age of 18 when they commenced these romantic relationships? Yes. And did the research that Dr. Walker and others in that field have done indicate that the symptoms of battered woman syndrome can arise within a year or two of entering such relationship? Correct. And a year or two in an abusive environment can create all these psychological deficits in a grown woman? Yes. Now, has the research with respect to the abuse of children revealed that children are particularly vulnerable to trauma? Yes. More vulnerable than adults? Yes. More vulnerable than adult women? Yes. And has the research indicated that children who are exposed to repeated and persistent abuse in all of its forms suffer the greatest damage? That's correct. And that the damage lasts the longest? Correct. And that it can last their entire lives? Yes. And that if not treated, it doesn't go away? Yes. And is there anything in the research that suggests that when your 18th birthday comes, you're cured? No. Or the 21st? No. Or your 30th? No. Or any particular milestone of age? It can last a lifetime. That's important. Does the research that Dr. Briere and others who treat the survivor population, those people who have, and by survived, they mean lived through childhood abuse, do they not? Adult survivors, yes. They're not dead, correct? Does the research among the adult populations show the identical kind of symptoms as women who had been in the battering relationships, sometimes far as little as 1 or 2 years? Yes, it does. Now, has Dr. Walker talked about in her research the connection of this or the similarity between PTSD and battered women syndrome? She did. Are you aware of the fact that battered women syndrome is admissible in the courts of California? Objection, that's irrelevant. Sustained. Well, Your Honor, I'd like to be heard on that. It doesn't have to be this minute. The court says, thank you. Let's go on to something else. Ms. Amerson says, now, one of the things that Mr. Conn read to you from Dr. Walker's statement concerning why women tend to develop battered women syndrome is being stuck, if you will, in these relationships, is that women have a very emotional relationship with the abuser. They find it hard to leave for emotional reasons. This is a bizarre symbiotic relationship. Yes. How would you describe the relationship between an abused child and the parent abuser? I would describe it as reciprocally dependent. Not reciprocal. That's totally wrong. Reciprocally is how you pronounce it. Reciprocally depend. I'm tired. Been reading a long time. I would describe it as reciprocally dependent if you like that symbiotic. So they depend on each other. So Jose and Kitty depend just as much on the brothers as they do on as the brothers depend on them. It's a dependent relationship back and forth. They need it to feed their control. They're wanting to have power over everything, right? So they have to have it for that reason. So it's a give and take kind of relationship all the time. Similar to what Dr. Walker is talking about. Yes. Is the bond between parent and child believed in psychological circles to be even stronger than the bond between spouses? Yes. Is there something that exists with respect to parents and children in abusive relationships that is called trauma bonding? Mr. Conn says, I would object as vague what counsel is referring to as child. The court says, overruled. You may answer the question. The witness says, yes. There is a term called traumatic bonding that refers to parent child relationships in traumatic, domestic, or family relationships. Ms. Abramson says, and what are the features of traumatic bonding? The features of traumatic bonding is that in the context of this relationship, which is abusive, in which there is harm to the child by the parent in whatever form, that the child nevertheless continues to have this bond with the abusive parent, and despite the destructive quality or the injurious quality or the emotionally denigrating quality of this abusive relationship, the child has the love and affection and attachment to the abusive parent, and it seems paradoxical because why would they have this? So the term was developed that was called traumatic bonding, indicating that there's trauma and abuse in the context of the relationship between the parent and the child. The bonding, nevertheless, continues. And hence, it was appropriate to describe it as traumatic bonding that has both components. On the one hand, the child's love and admiration and wish for love from the parent, and at the same time, fear, helplessness, and anxiety in terms of the attachment to the parental figure, primarily because that parental figure is often unstable, unpredictable, unreliable, untrustworthy, and abusive. So you have all those elements combined in a traumatic bonding situation, and hence the term is a phenomenon that's noted in the literature that when society intervenes and tries to take children away from abusive parents, those children cry and are disconsolate and want to come back and want to stay. Like you can't console them. Objection, irrelevant. The court says sustained as to the form of the question. Is traumatic bonding something that's observed in the context of child protective services trying to separate children from abusive parents? Objection irrelevant. Ms. Abramson says, it's the last question on this, Your Honor. The court says, well, when you're talking about children, what are you talking about? I'm talking about children. Court says, infants or what? Infants can't express themselves. Court says, well, what's the age of a child? What is it? There has to be some time frame for the witness to answer the question. Ms. Abramson says, well, children who are able to express their feelings, let's say children over 7, the witness says, now, what's the question? Ms. Abramson says, the question is it a phenomenon that's observed when society tries to intervene and take children away from abusive parents that the children protest and they demonstrate traumatic bonding? Objection, vague and irrelevant. Overruled. You may answer the question. The witness says, yes, it's observed every day. Yes. Ms. Abramson says, and that's true even when the children are teenagers, is it not? Yes. And did you form the opinion as to whether or not there had been traumatic bonding between Erik and either of his parents? Yes. And was there? Yes. Is an early form of traumatic bonding something called anxious attachment? Yes. And is that when an infant clings to a parent who is being not emotionally responsive? Yes. Objection irrelevant. Overruled. Yes, says witness. Samerson says, and was there evidence in this case based on the reports of family members that Erik Menendez demonstrated anxious attachment towards his mother? Objection irrelevant and evidence code section 352. Overruled. You can answer the question. Yes, there is. So all that BS that the state was going on and on and on about how Erik didn't love his mother because the only thing he could remember kind coming from his mother was a smile. That was like the only form of kind affection from her was a smile from across the room. Like not even touching him or consoling him, comforting him, nothing. It was a smile. That was the nicest thing Kitty ever did for Erik. So, all of that BS that the state went through to try to drag Erik and make it seem like Erik didn't have an attachment to his mom. Here this witness just testified with reports, evidence from other family members. He says he believes that Erik did have this traumatic bonding with his mother. Miss Abramson asks, now, Dr. Conn or Mr. Conn also read to you Dr. Walker's statement that women stay in these abusive relationships because of complex psychosocial reasons. Yes. Do children stay in abusive relationships for simple reasons? Objection, vague and irrelevant. It's argumentative as to the form of the question as well. Well, are the reasons why children stay with their abusive families complex or simple? Objection, irrelevant, overruled. The witness says, yes, they're very complex. Now this goes to the whole, yeah, of course he didn't want this in, but it goes to the whole, why didn't Erik just leave? He could have just gotten up and left at any time. He was 18, going on 19. He wasn't like prepped for life at any point by his parents. So no, he couldn't have just up and left. He didn't know he could just up and leave. And if he did, he probably wouldn't be very self-sufficient if he had tried to do it on his own. Ms. Abramson says, do children have much of a choice about where they are? Objection, vague. Rephrase the question. Do children have much choice about where they can live and what they can do? Court says, when you say children, what are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about abused children. At what age? Asks the court. Ms. Abramson says, at any age until they're emancipated. Do they have much choice about where they can be? Generally not. Like, why was it so hard to get that question in? Really? We needed to specify that they needed to be emancipated? Now, you recall Dr. Walker's statement that women are not paid comparable wages to men as one of the reasons why they get into these dependent relationships. Yes, I do. Are 18-year-old boys who have never gotten any training or in any skilled field paid comparable wages to skilled men? No. You remember Dr. Walker's statement that one of the reasons why women wind up trapped in these relationships is because they lack skills in the workforce. Yes. Do 18-year-old young men who have never been permitted to work to have any job but have been trained to do nothing but play tennis have any skill for the workforce? Objection, argumentative, and improper expert opinion. And what? Improper expert opinion, says Mr. Conn. The court says sustained. Ms. Abramson says, in the sense that Dr. Walker was talking in generalities, there are some women who have plenty of workforce skills, aren't there? Of course. Ms. Nahara says, uh, Ms. Nahara, for example. Yes. The court reporter, for example. She's giving examples of people that have skills in the workforce. Ms. Nahara, the court reporter. Mr. Conn says irrelevant, and the court says we really don't need Dr. Wilson to tell us about those things. So go on to something else. Ms. Abramson says, do you remember that in our society, women are considered as, I don't know when she wrote this, belonging to men and being like property? Objection, asked to strike the comment. The court says, didn't hear the comment, so I can't strike it. She didn't make a comment, did she? Oh, I don't know when she wrote this. She made a comment. The court says, let's start over. Ms. Abramson says, do you remember in this statement that Dr. Walker writes that there is a societal view that women belong to men and that they are like their property? Yes. Do you believe that in our society view children are less regarded as property than women? Objection, improper expert opinion. Objection sustained. Samuelson says, are there studies of families and parenting and concepts of how children are viewed in American culture right now? Mr. Conn says, objection, improper expert opinion. Overruled. The witness says, yes, there are such things. Ms. Abramson says, and is there evidence that in many families, children are viewed as property? Objection, irrelevant. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, do children have the same rights as adults? Mr. Conn says, objection, irrelevant. The court says, it's also beyond the field of expert opinion. Next question. Ms. Emerson says, now you were contacted concerning testifying in this hearing, which had to do with the current state of research of psychological syndromes, correct? That's correct. And you were contacted originally to see if you were available for that hearing by Mr. Levin? Correct. And for the purpose of that hearing, did you have any contact whatsoever with Erik Menendez? No. For the purpose of that hearing, did you read his testimony from that first trial? No. Did you have any specific information about his background or about his previous statements? No. Was that what's known as well, strike that. For the purpose of that reading, were you relying solely on the research in the field and the manner in which one of the experts who testified on his behalf at the first trial had presented her information? Yes. And the expert was Dr. Ann Burgess, correct? Objection, irrelevant, overruled. You can answer the question, says the court. The witness says, yes, it was. Ms. Amerson says, so is it true then that the only testimony from a previous trial that you had before that hearing was the testimony of Dr. Burgess? Correct. And was much of your testimony at that hearing concerning the evolution of the research in traumatic stress syndromes of various kinds? Yes, it was. And at that hearing, were you covering many of the the types of traumatic stress syndromes that you put in the book that you edited, the International Handbook of Traumatic Stress Syndromes? That's correct. And were you testifying, apart from battered person syndrome, were you also testifying to other labels for similar things, such as abused child syndrome? Objection, irrelevant. Overruled. The witness says yes. Ms. Abramson asks, and are there articles, well, specifically, is there work in that handbook by a Dr. Green who's recognized as an expert in the traumatic stress syndromes of abused children? Yes. Objection, irrelevant, and beyond the scope of expert opinion. Sustained. The answer stricken. We're almost at 4:30. How long did you think your redirect was going to take? Just an approximation. Well, part of tomorrow morning, says Ms. Abramson. The court says, okay. Well, let's take our break now and get organized, and we'll resume tomorrow at 8:30. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions. We will resume tomorrow at 8:30. The jury exits the courtroom. The court says, apparently, counsel, there is an exhibit 400D and there is also a 400A, and they're identical. You couldn't find 400A at some earlier time. Ms. Abramson says, no, we did find A. I'm sorry. May I inquire of the clerk? Yes, the one that I thought was lost, that was 400A. Should be marked 400D. That's the one I think you're holding in your hand, Your Honor, the one with the questions. Court says, yes. Then was something else 400A? Yes, 400A was the original draft, says Ms. Abramson. The court says, okay, so the document is 400D. We will be in recess until tomorrow. And that's where I leave you. And I really am not feeling great. If you can't tell, I'm struggling just to kind of get through. So I'm going to let you guys go. Let me know what you think down below in the comments. And I will see you guys in the next one. Take care. Thanks for watching. Bye. That's the end of this Trial Transcripts Exposed. Thanks for following along with me. Like if you want more, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below. See you next time.